Hello, and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and I'm coming to you live from the Stephen O. Friendly Atheist Studio in Freethought Hall, which is FFRF's office in Madison, Wisconsin. Today on Ask an Atheist, we're asking, what is wrong with Clarence Thomas? I'm sure you might have some opinions of your own on this topic, so as always, we want to include your questions in today's program. Just leave your questions and comments in the chat on Facebook or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And joining me today from Washington, D.C. is Mark Dan, who is FFRF's Director of Government Affairs. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Dan. Today, we'll be speaking with Meagan Hatcher-Mays, Indivisible's Director of Democracy Policy. We'll talk with her about Clarence Thomas's latest scandal, where he forgot to mention he was taking lavish trips paid for by a right-wing mega donor. We'll also talk with Meagan about Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk, a Trump-appointed judge that FFRF opposed, who recently overturned the use of mifepristone, one of two drugs prescribed to women to obtain medical abortions. And we'll speak to Meagan about how to un-gerrymander the courts. FFRF works with Meagan as part of the Unrig the Courts Coalition, which Meagan is a co-chair, and the coalition seeks to expand the Supreme Court. Meagan can be found on Twitter at Important Meagan.
How did you pronounce it? Mifepristone or mufepristone?
Mifepristone.
Okay.
I think, but probably our guest might be able to enlighten us a little bit more on that one.
Okay.
But we're trying
to or maybe some of our viewers. This show is called Ask an Atheist, so you can ask us questions. But we have a question from you, the audience. What do you think Clarence and Ginny Thomas talk about at night? If you have an answer, put it in the comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And assuming it's a family-friendly answer, we might read it on today's show. And remember, FFRF, we're a nonprofit. We're a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. So we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections, and we don't endorse any such views that might be expressed here.
All right. Meagan, welcome to Ask an Atheist. Great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about today. So recently you were on MSNBC talking with Mehdi Hassan, along with another friend of Ask an Atheist, Wajahat Ali, about Clarence Thomas. And Bruce has a clip of it.
Harlan Crow's Nazi memorabilia might have been the most eye-catching item to come out of the ProPublica reporting. It wasn't in the ProPublica reporting, but it's emerged since then. But of course, the most significant revelation, if we take a step back, is that we have a justice on the Supreme Court who's effectively using GOP billionaires like human slot machines.
That's right. Yeah, I think really you couldn't ask for a better illustration of everything that's wrong with the Supreme Court in one story.
So the story that was mentioned on MSNBC was ProPublica's report that Justice Thomas isn't exactly flying on the middle seat on Spirit Airlines, and he's getting a lot of trips paid for by mega right-wing donors, namely Harlan Crow. He's spending time on Crow's 161-foot yacht, the Michaela Rose, and flies on Crow's Bombardier Global 5000, which can fly from New York to Tokyo without refueling. So, Meagan, how's a public servant allowed to do this?
You know, it sounds like a great gig if you can get it, but it's obviously sort of appallingly and on its face unethical. But the reason that this, I wouldn't say it's allowed, but one of the reasons why Thomas has been able to get away with this for so long is because the Supreme Court, unlike the rest of the federal judiciary, is not bound by a formal code of ethics. Chief Justice John Roberts says that, we generally follow the same code of ethics as the lower courts do, or we reference that code of ethics if we have a question about our own behavior. But there's no real checks and balances there as far as the ethical shortcomings of the various justices. So Thomas actually, very interestingly, used to disclose some of these gifts and travel that he receives from his very wealthy friends. There was an LA Times expose about that about 20 years ago, and then he just stopped disclosing the gifts that he was receiving. Doesn't mean he stopped receiving the gifts. It just means he stopped disclosing them. So this most recent story, shows years worth of lavish vacations, just like you said, flights on private jets, rides on fancy yachts to tropical and exotic locations. And he never disclosed any of it. So it's not a good look for a Supreme Court justice to be receiving gifts like this, especially since this person, Harlan Crow, might have business in front of the Supreme Court. We would never know if there was a conflict of interest there.
So it's not a good look, obviously, but it's a nice job if you can get it, it looks like. So who is this friend of Thomas? Who is Harlan Crow, and why is he bankrolling Justice Thomas's lifestyle?
Yeah, so Harlan Crow is an exceedingly wealthy individual. He's a real estate developer. He, I think, was the president of the Wyndham Hotels and Casinos for a long time. He is on the founding committee of the Club for Growth, which is a pretty well-known kind of booster of Republican candidates for the House and Senate. They raise a lot of money for Republican candidates for office. So he's kind of a long-time, hyper-partisan, extremely right-wing corporate political player, and he became friends with Clarence Thomas after he was sworn in as a justice. Not that that matters really as far as ethics is concerned. And they probably have a lot in common because Clarence Thomas, as with the rest of the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, almost always rules in favor of wealthy corporate interests and against, regular everyday people. So that's probably something that they bonded over on the yacht, would be my guess. And this is kind of like Clarence Thomas's reward for doing things in the service of Harlan Crow's interests. Whether or not Harlan Crow has actual cases or business in front of the Supreme Court, his interests are in fact being litigated in front of the Supreme Court, whether he's a party to the case or not. His interests are not having to pay taxes and being as rich as possible. And those are also Clarence Thomas's interests.
And Harlan Crow seems to be doing a great job of that, plus making money the old-fashioned way, inheriting a fair.
Correct.
That looked like that was a picture of Napoleon behind him on the couch. I don't know if that was or not, but if it was, he was a dictator. So in response to the ProPublica article, Judge Thomas stated, "Early in my tenure at the court, I sought guidance from my colleagues and others in the judiciary and was advised that this sort of personal hospitality from close personal friends who did not have business before the court was not reportable. I've endeavored to follow that counsel throughout my tenure, and I've always sought to comply with the disclosure guidelines." And he will try to follow the new guidelines established by the courts in the past few weeks. So do you buy this, Meagan? And whether you do or not, why do you say that his actions are unethical?
It would be funny if I said, yeah, I buy that. But no, I don't at all. I think, he says, well, I'm allowed to accept these gifts because he's a personal friend of mine. But these guys would not be friends if Clarence Thomas wasn't a Supreme Court justice. That's just, it just wouldn't. They just wouldn't be. This is happening because of who Clarence Thomas is and because of who Harlan Crow is. Judges are supposed to both avoid impropriety, but also they're supposed to avoid the appearance of impropriety. And anybody looking at this situation is not thinking, oh, well, yeah, sure, you could absolutely accept hundreds of thousands of dollars in free gifts and travel and be fair if that person's interests came before you in front of the court. No one would think that. And so in that sense, it is unethical. But there's more that Congress needs to be doing to ensure that there is actually a codified code of ethics that applies to the Supreme Court. There's a bill that Senator Whitehouse has introduced called SCIRT, or Supreme Court Ethics and Transparency Bill, that should be moved through the Judiciary Committee as soon as possible and sent to the floor for a vote. It might not pass the House, given the makeup of the House, but everybody should be on the record saying whether or not they think it's okay for a Supreme Court justice to accept gifts like this and have sort of these conflicts of interest in his personal relationships and not face any consequences for having done that.
Right. And also good to note for a lot of our viewers that the House version is sponsored by Congressional Free Thought Caucus member Hank Johnson. And obviously we're very much in support of that, as are many of our friends as well. And so one thing I always thought was interesting, Judge Thomas said about his vacations, I prefer RV parks, I prefer the Walmart parking lots to the beaches and things like that. There's something normal to me about it. I come from regular stock and I prefer that. I prefer being around that. But he also seems like he enjoys going to Bali on Crow's Jet. And then there's this painting in Crow's 105-acre resort and when you visit there. So can you talk a little bit about who is in this modern American masterpiece and why is it important?
Well, Harlan Crow is in it. I think he's the guy on the far right in the really attractive sandals. Clarence Thomas is in it.
Well,
yeah, you can see him. You can see Clarence Thomas smoking a cigar and kind of holding court. I think that's Leonard Leo to the left, left of center. Yeah. Just so everyone, I'm sure your audience is aware of who Leonard Leo is, but this man is heavily involved in the conservative capture of the federal judiciary, not just the Supreme Court, but the lower courts as well. He was the head of a group called the Federalist Society, which on paper is like a conservative student group at law schools, but in reality is kind of a juggernaut of I don't even know where to begin with the Federalist Society, but basically the goal of the Federalist Society is to, recruit as many conservative law students as they can to become, prosecutors, corporate lawyers, or whatever, get them primed up to be very conservative judges, and then ideally go on to become very conservative Supreme Court justices. The conservative movement was kind of burned by a couple of justices in the past who were nominated and confirmed by Republican presidents who ended up being kind of liberal. So they really doubled down on their efforts to make sure that everybody they were confirming to the courts were actually as conservative as they said. And that's how we ended up with folks like Alito. Scalia was one of the first faculty advisors for the Federalist Society when it was founded back in the 80s. And he went on, of course, to be a Supreme Court justice. So these are the kind of people that are all hanging out and being friends at Harlan Crow's extremely fancy forest retreat with, a full-size replica of Hagrid's cabin from Harry Potter. That's serious. That was in there.
Yeah, that's actually, that's definitely a thing about that. And so with Leonard Leo, Harlan Crow, and Judge Thomas are just talking about, I'm sure, when they get together about the various trees and things in the Adirondacks, not necessarily about how on earth we're going to have a conservative capture of the courts in any way, shape, or form. And as you've also mentioned, I think on a few things, Leonard Leo, basically, if you need cash for a Supreme Court campaign, he's your guy.
Yeah, and he briefly left the Federalist Society during the Trump administration to become Trump's lead on judicial nominations. So, the list of Donald Trump had a Supreme Court shortlist with names on it. That list was written by Leonard Leo. He wrote all the names down on it, handed it to Trump, and Trump picked those people off of Leonard Leo's list. So almost all of the judges that Donald Trump nominated were hand selected by Leonard Leo, this extremely conservative, right-wing, very Catholic individual who has very deep pockets because of his relationships with dark money organizations, and who, is kind of a kingmaker as far as conservative lawyers becoming judges is concerned. And so those are the type of people that Clarence Thomas is actually vacationing with. And I'm sure they're not just talking about, fishing. I'm sure they're talking about other stuff too.
Other stuff. And we'll be talking about Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk, one of those products of the Trump nomination machine, a little bit later in the show.
So I need to say that this issue is really important to the Freedom from Religion Foundation, because religion is one of the issues that comes up before the court. And we've seen now with these new right-wing appointments how disastrous their decisions have been to the First Amendment on Establishment Clause and freedom of religion. So we're watching this very closely. We've had a case before the Supreme Court, and we have cases before the courts. But I want to ask you, Meagan, do you think, are all the justices doing this, or is Thomas different from the other Supreme Court justices?
I think the scale, as far as Clarence Thomas is concerned, is probably larger, and this feels a lot really scandalous because he didn't disclose any of it when he probably should have. But it's not uncommon for justices to disclose questionable gifts or travel that they've received. Just last summer, after the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, Alito accepted a trip to Rome to talk about getting, his success in overturning Roe and making it more difficult to access abortions. He took some pot shots at foreign prime ministers too, which was very strange.
Yeah, we saw that was speech, a very self-serving speech.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
It was very much so. And that trip was paid for by Notre Dame's. They have a clinic at the Notre Dame Law School called the Religious Liberty Initiative. It remains to be seen if he will actually disclose who they're paid for it. He has until June of this year to tell us who paid for it. But those are the types of trips it's not uncommon to see Supreme Court justices accept. But even if they disclose them, it's obvious that accepting those types of trips provides an appearance of impropriety. The Religious Liberty Initiative at Notre Dame has cases pending in front of the Supreme Court. It's not good to take, a sponsored free trip to Italy on their dime and then turn around and hear a case where you might rule in their favor. It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in the legitimacy of the court. So the conservative justices in particular have a lot of, I think, unknown, unreported relationships with dark money groups. That includes Leonard Leo and some of his extracurricular activities. But there's a lot of ones that they do report that, and even though they report them, they're still very bad and still, have people questioning whether or not the court is a fair arbiter of justice or if they're captured by these very right-wing conservative interests.
Yeah, we would never do something like this, but what if the Freedom from Religion Foundation were to pay for an expensive trip for one of the justices how would that look? You know what I mean?
It would look bad, yeah.
And people would scream, right? What kind of influence are you trying to peddle here?
Yeah, so, it happens all the time with, Tucker Carlson is always attacking DAs whose campaigns take money from George Soros-affiliated PACs or whatever, and they make a big deal. They'll talk about that for weeks on weeks at a time. It's silly, but when it comes to something like this, it's like, oh, that's fine. It's just a yacht, just a private jet. It's fine.
Everybody's got those. So,
yeah.
Do you think Congress should take action against Judge Thomas?
Yeah, 1,000%. I think, Dick Durbin has a responsibility. He said that he will act, and Mazie Hirono, who's on the Judiciary Committee, has also said that the committee is going to have hearings on this. This really shouldn't wait. I think the court's reputation is already at a historic all-time low, and I think Democrats have a responsibility to explain to the American people what they're doing. Well, let's just say I think Congress has the responsibility to show the American people what they're doing to fix this glaring problem in our government right now. A co-equal branch of government is apparently immune from consequences when they behave unethically. So the Judiciary Committee should hold hearings on this. They should absolutely be investigating Thomas, not just for these gifts, but he also refused to recuse himself in a case involving his wife's involvement in the January 6th attacks. There's a lot of, and also it's not just Clarence Thomas. Samuel Alito reportedly leaked the Hobby Lobby decision when that came out. It's probably 8 years ago now. He leaked that to anti-abortion activists before the case was actually released, and we still haven't had a hearing on that reported ethical lapse either. So the Judiciary Committee should be announcing hearings like that. I think they should, sooner rather than later, announce hearings on Thomas and Alito and their ethical lapses. And I think that they should move that Supreme Court ethics bill as soon as is possible.
Yeah, and that would do a lot to clean up the courts, have regular reporting on transparency, what is allowed, what is not allowed when a justice recuses themselves. So we think it is a very strong bill and moving towards good governance and transparency. So let's take a quick pause and reintroduce our guest. We're talking with Meagan Hatcher-Mays from Indivisible. She's the Director of Democracy Policy, where she manages the Unrig the Courts Coalition, which seeks to break the right-wing gerrymandering of the courts through expansion. And be sure to answer today's audience question. What do you think Clarence and Ginny Thomas talk about at night? Put your answer in the comment section or send it to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And assuming it's family friendly, we might read it on the air.
So just to back up a little bit, even if Congress did everything imaginable, how would that be enforced with the highest court in the land?
Yeah, exactly. So I think implied in everything we've talked about today is, at the end of the day, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court is probably a lost cause. You can impose Supreme Court ethics on them, but you really need justices who are willing to abide by that code. And right now we don't have that. So at the end of the day, you can't just pursue one reform. You can't just pursue Supreme Court ethics. You can't just pursue term limits. You have to add seats to the Supreme Court. We need 4 new Supreme Court justices to really even out the problems that we have that are justice-made problems facing the institution of the Supreme Court. So it's really an all of the above thing. You need to add the 4 seats and then impose these other reforms upon a body that will actually abide by those reforms.
That would be one way.
Otherwise, you just have the same problem over and over again.
One way to try to unrig the courts at all levels. And talking about Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society, it's not just at the Supreme Court, it's judges at all levels. Let's talk about this Texas judge. How do you say his name? Kacsmaryk? Kacsmaryk. He's a Trump-appointed judge. We've known him as a right-wing legal lawyer. He suspended the Food and Drug Administration's longtime approval of key abortion pill mifepristone, if I'm saying that right. We, FFRF, opposed Kacsmaryk's appointment, saying that Kacsmaryk, general counsel at the time at the infamous First Liberty Institute, is a direct threat to the separation of state and church, Roe v. Wade, and LGBTQ rights. He's categorically unfit for the federal bench, is what we said. And it looks like our fears came true. And he's anything but a judge who simply, as all judges say, he simply calls balls and strikes. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it was pretty obvious when he was sitting through his confirmation hearing that he was not going to be neutral. His opinions are pretty well cemented in his own mind. He's been an anti-abortion activist for most of his career, and he was selected by, Leonard Leo probably because of that. That's one of the reasons why he probably was nominated to be a judge in the first place. And that was why he was confirmed. And this is the outcome of that confirmation. This was the reason he was selected. And this ruling in this case is like the fruit of that choice. So he's really not a very good judge. I think it's really interesting that even the Republicans who voted to confirm him have been very silent on this case, because what he's done is unprecedented. Just so everyone watching knows, this has never happened before, where a federal judge has ruled that the FDA needs to remove an approved medication from the shelves. That's never happened. And I think, even if Matthew Kacsmaryk was some sort of scientific genius, it would be unprecedented, but he's also not that either. I think you can tell that from reading his opinion that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He adopts almost wholesale the messaging from the anti-abortion movement in his opinion, and he misrepresents the science of the medication and just basically out of nowhere, out of whole cloth, invents a whole new way for judges to interfere in our healthcare decisions. So it's very scary. If this decision holds, it's very scary what this could mean for other medications that have already been approved. And just so everyone is aware, mifepristone is still available. It has not been removed from the shelves as of yet. And it's not even clear that the judge has the authority to tell the FDA to remove medication from the shelves. So you can still get it. If you have appointments, you should keep your appointment. But it's also a very safe medication. It was approved for 23 years before this case came to the court. So
Annie Laurie Gaylor, who's co-president here at FFRF, she says Judge Kacsmaryk is practicing medicine without a license.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This was just, you don't need to get past the first page to see that this man is not serious about health and safety. His first footnote says he's not going to use the word fetus, that the word fetus is not a scientific term, and instead he's going to use what he thinks is a more scientific term, which is the phrase unborn human. That's obviously not a recognized medical term for any stage of pregnancy. So that's about how serious, scientifically serious that opinion is. It's not, but it's obviously a very serious situation we have found ourselves in, but it's not a very scientifically rigorous opinion at all.
I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV. But so I'm guessing his terminology and the way he argued this probably wouldn't pass too many law schools in the country.
No, unless maybe you went to, maybe if you were a lawyer in Notre Dame's Religious Liberty Initiative Clinic or something. I don't know, but it was pretty rough. He, this judge is. It's hard to say what will happen. I think that even like right after, even pharmaceutical companies were coming out and saying you've gone too far. And usually pharmaceutical companies are more sort of conservative Republican aligned in their advocacy. So it could be that this really is just a step too far in their view. So we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say about it. But I would expect this to go to the Supreme Court pretty quickly, especially since there is a contradictory ruling out of Washington State saying that the FDA cannot remove mifepristone from the shelves. So I think the Supreme Court will at least have to resolve which opinion controls until they can hear the full case. But it just really hammers home the notion that the judges who sit on the bench matters so greatly to the continued health of our fundamental constitutional rights. And so when you are, your senator basically has a huge role to play in whether or not judges are ultimately confirmed. And so we should all really be thinking about that long and hard as we're kind of developing our voting strategy.
Isn't that kind of scary because the same justices on the Supreme Court were recommended by the Federalist Society who recommended Kacsmaryk?
Yeah, it is. I don't want to pretend that I have some special information about how this might go. I just do find it kind of interesting that even the pharmaceutical companies were saying that this was way too far and that they didn't support this ruling. I don't know what the Supreme Court will say. It certainly, if this holds, opens the door for a bunch of different conservative challenges to medications that they don't like. There's a similar case also from Texas, but a different judge, where the judge ruled that PrEP, which is a medication that helps prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS, did not need to be covered by health insurance. So that could be another type of medication that conservative activists go after next. It's very scary, the implications of this ruling if it were to hold.
Yeah, because gays should die, right, in their minds. Right.
Yeah, I think it's very likely that there's a lot of different medications that they think, depending on the type of person who typically takes it, those will be the medications that they go after next, for sure. And that includes contraception probably also.
Great. So in the case where Kacsmaryk suspended the use of mifepristone, it was brought by the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which the Alliance Defending Freedom is a major player in. So how did this group manage to get their case in front of a judge who had a pretty good chance would rule in their favor? How did that work?
Well, it was shockingly simple. So just so everyone knows, Matthew Kacsmaryk is the only judge sitting in the district in Amarillo, sorry. So if you bring a case in Amarillo, in federal court in Amarillo, there's a 100% chance Matthew Kacsmaryk will hear it. There's no other judge in that district. So it's as simple as establishing, the residency requirements, basically, to bring a case in that federal court in that district. And that's what they did. And Matthew Kacsmaryk got it. I mean, obviously, Matthew Kacsmaryk is the culmination of like 50 years of the right trying to take over the court. So the reason he got that job is precisely for this reason. They want this single judge district to be as conservative as possible so that their conservative lawyer friends can bring cases there, and then Matthew Kacsmaryk can rule in their favor. And that's exactly how it played out in this case.
Any of our groups who take cases before the courts, we do consider which judges, we all do that when we take a case. Who might it go before, or what are the chances? But doesn't this kind of look more like gaming the system all around?
Yeah, it's a really hyper speed version of forum shopping. Like, every lawyer, of course, wants to take your case to the friendliest possible district, the friendliest possible judge. It's very rare that as a lawyer, when you take a case to court, that you're guaranteed of an outcome. But if you're a lawyer for the Alliance Defending Freedom and you bring a case in front of Matthew Kacsmaryk, you are guaranteed to know what the outcome is.
So if
you're going to be having a good Christmas party.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So if as Kacsmaryk's ruling stands, what do you think the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services should do, or what might they do?
Yeah, so like I said before, it's really unclear that this judge has the authority to actually force the FDA to remove the medication from the shelves. I think at best, all the FDA would have to do to comply with this order would be to start a process of reviewing mifepristone's approval. And then that process might ultimately result in the FDA determining that the approval was correct. But I think a more aggressive version of that would be not to comply with the order at all. And if I were them, I would be giving some serious consideration to not complying with it at all, because I don't think that this judge has the authority to tell them what to do in this instance. And I think that if they comply with it and actually remove medication, you're granting legitimacy to a process that was very clearly illegitimate. So I think Representative Ocasio-Cortez has said this also, and I think she's right, that there's really no reason for the FDA to comply to the extent where they're actually removing medication from the shelves. I think that's silly.
And don't they have some discretion anyway in what they decide?
Yeah, they do. Agencies in general are given pretty wide discretion in determining what to approve, rulemaking, because the agencies are made up of experts. It's generally been the case that the court understands that the agencies have all the expertise and the courts don't. The courts are usually not made up of, highly trained scientists and doctors, because if you were a highly trained scientist or doctor, you wouldn't be a judge. So usually they grant a great deal of deference to agencies in these sorts of approvals, although that also has been starting to change a little bit given the conservative lean of the court.
So turning for a moment to court expansion reform, in your role as leader of the Unrig the Courts Coalition, or the convener of the table, you're advocating for expanding the Supreme Court to end the right-wing gerrymandering of the court. Yet some would argue that it's a highly polarizing issue, and many more right-wing folks would say it's a dangerous power grab by liberals. Do you think these criticisms are valid?
No, I don't. I think, look, I know a lot of times when we talk to folks about the need for court expansion, everyone's immediate reaction is, oh, yeah, but if we add seats now, if Republicans ever gain power in the future, they'll add seats down the line. And I think that what folks need to understand is this idea that we're in some sort of vicious cycle, or that we would kick off a vicious cycle. It's kind of too late. We're in it. We're in a vicious cycle right now. Generally speaking, Republicans have been the party to really aggressively do everything in their power to reshape the courts in the conservative image. And I think you don't really need to look much further than Mitch McConnell refusing to even grant Barack Obama's nominee to replace Justice Scalia refused to even grant Merrick Garland a hearing. They held that seat open for over a year until they could fill it with somebody that was picked by Donald Trump. So this vicious cycle, this tit for tat, we're already in it. Court expansion is actually a solution to that problem. Instead of increasing the politicization of the court, I think it would actually restore a lot of the public's faith in the Supreme Court, because we could then boast a Supreme Court that was actually made up of justices who follow the law, follow the Constitution, and are not bought and paid for by conservative dark money interests. That's the situation that we find ourselves in now. So this is not just an issue of, well, I have sour grapes because I disagree with a lot of the conservative justices' rulings. It's more like the conservative justices are doing partisan political favors for one political party over another. And as a result, they are a threat to the health of our democracy. They've gutted the Voting Rights Act. Every single chance they've gotten to gut the Voting Rights Act, they have. They've made it more difficult to engage in the democratic process, to vote. And then once they did that, they started chipping away at our other fundamental rights, including abortion, our right to be safe and healthy at work. They chip away at all of that. And because they've already gutted our ability to exact political consequences on politicians that go along with it, that power is like continually hoarded by an increasingly conservative court. So the only solution, I kind of wish there was some other way to fix this, but there's not, because there's no situation where these guys wake up one day and say, oh, you know what? Actually, maybe I was wrong about labor unions, or maybe I was wrong about granting personhood to corporations. That's never going to happen. The only way to get ourselves out of this problem is to add more seats and fill those seats with justices who are committed to our democracy.
Well, that has happened historically, that occasionally a justice, but with this court, it looks very slim. Well, I think what you're saying is that when liberals today are being accused of trying to pack the court's already been packed, and your efforts to unrig the court are really trying to unpack what's already been packed by the conservatives. Some people say that, well, this court expansion, it's just people don't like the court's rulings. We just don't like how they rule, so we want to try to circumvent the decisions, move beyond that. Have we gotten into a very dangerous era with this?
I think we're in a very dangerous era right now because of the court that we have right now, and sure, there are Supreme Court opinions that I just disagree with on ideological grounds or something. But a lot of these cases are existential. They had a really bad case last term about gun safety regulations, which basically makes it near impossible for states to issue new gun safety regulations unless that state can prove that those regulations existed at the time the Second Amendment was drafted. So our gun laws are basically being pulled all the way back to the 18th century. We're all getting pulled back to the 18th century, kicking and screaming, basically, when it comes to some of our most fundamental rights. So this isn't just an issue of, well, I wouldn't have decided the case that way, or, Brett Kavanaugh's favorite color is red, but mine's green. It's not that. It's much more serious than that. And I really want to impress upon people the health of our democracy really is at stake, because the conservative majority is also attacking our ability to participate in our democracy. When that has happened in the past, that's happened during the Civil War, actually, the president added seats. Congress added seats to the Supreme Court. Lincoln was worried that the Supreme Court was made up of justices who were favorable or friendly to the interests of the South, and he didn't want that, so he added seats to make sure that we had a Supreme Court that was favorable to democracy instead. The size of the court has changed multiple times over the years, and one of the major times that happened, it was to protect our democracy, and we are in almost an identical situation now.
So I do think Justice Kavanaugh's favorite color is red these days. So Meagan, do you have a few more minutes to take questions from some of our viewers?
Yeah.
I have this little iPad here with questions on it that Greg has been transferring over. Thank you, Greg. A question from Dan C. How do we get more federal judges in Kacsmaryk's district in Amarillo? so that he doesn't take every case and then rule for the theocrats? Is there a way to do that?
Well, yeah, so just in the same way that Congress can increase the number of seats to the Supreme Court. So I should have mentioned there's nothing in the Constitution that sets the number of Supreme Court justices at 9. It's fluctuated over the years. It's been 6, it's been 7. For a while it was 8, now it's 9. No reason why it can't be 13, you know? The same is true for the lower courts as well. There's no set number of federal judgeships that should exist at any given time. Congress sets that number. The last time there was like a huge expansion of the lower courts, or the number of lower court judgeships, was under Jimmy Carter. So Congress could do that again. They could increase the number of lower court seats and kind of, restore some balance to the lower courts that way. I don't know if it would necessarily add a seat in Amarillo. I think that district is pretty small, probably can't really make the case that it needs to have more than one judge. But this is obviously a very big problem, that there is just this one judge, and he is, kind of in the tank for very extreme conservative interests.
There actually is a non-political, practical reason for expanding to 13, in that if you include the military, there are actually 13 different
That's right.
districts. And so it would make more sense just for the workload now that the country is growing.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so a question from Jenny R. Is this ban, I presume it's mifepristone, is this ban paving a path to the restriction of more medications down the line? And if this happens, then where do you draw the line?
I think so. I mean, I think if this ruling holds, I think a lot of medication that conservatives have kind of identified as, part of this culture war that they're waging. And I mentioned earlier, PrEP is one of those drugs that they've already started to attack in other ways. I think contraception is definitely up there too as a medication that they would love to take off the market as well. I think if this ruling stands, I think those medications are at risk. I don't know that there is a way for the courts to draw a line like just at mifepristone and nothing else. I think this really opens up a massive can of worms that hard to say if the Supreme Court will go for it or not, but we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have the gift of prophecy, do you?
I wish I did. I mean, I think, one thing I think folks should look out for, I should have mentioned this when we were talking about Kacsmaryk before, he brings up this piece of this federal law in his opinion called the Comstock Act, which prohibits sending obscene material through the mail. And it originally said you can't send items that cause abortions or contraception through the mail either. This law hasn't been enforced in, like almost 100 years. And he's trying to bring this back as a reason why you can't send mifepristone through the mail. That's one area where I think the Supreme Court might latch onto that as a possibility, because the fact that you can receive abortion care through the mail is an existential threat to the anti-abortion activists. It's easier for them to ban surgical abortions in their states. It's a lot harder to prevent the federal government from okaying the mailing of mifepristone through the mail. That's a problem for them. So I think they're looking at new ways to try to block mail order access to mifepristone and probably contraception too. So that's one possibility for how that case might end up. Mifepristone will still be available, but you couldn't get it through the mail. Just a guess. I'm not saying that will or won't happen, but it's a possibility.
Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was charged under the Comstock Act. That goes way, way back. And maybe that's relevant. Maybe that's what they're thinking about. Birth control. There's one more question from the audience here, from Mario A. Republicans are on their way to reduce democracy. So what else can be done about this?
Well, the threats to our democracy are many and increasing. A lot of them are happening at the state level. So if you're writing in from a state that has, like a state like, say, Tennessee, that we just saw a very appalling and direct attack on democracy when they expelled a couple of lawmakers. It's something to keep an eye out for in your own state first. I think that's kind of where they've shifted the conservatives have shifted a lot of their attention is to state-based attacks on democracy and access to the ballot. So that's something to keep an eye on. Another thing will be to make sure that as we head into 2024 and 2025, that we have a president and a Congress who is willing to pass much needed structural democracy reforms. I know a lot of activists fought really hard to get it was originally called the For the People Act, and then it ended up being called the Freedom to Vote Act, which would have restored parts of the Voting Rights Act. It would have made it easier for folks to vote, provided a lot of federal funding for improved election systems. That's the kind of thing we should probably be asking our elected officials about in the run-up to 2024 and 2025 so that we can get that passed at the federal level, override some of these really bad state laws, and have a chance to actually have a multiracial functional democracy.
Yeah, we the people, what a concept, So remember we asked a question of the viewers, and you can answer it too, Meagan, if you want to. At the beginning of the show, we asked, what do you think the Thomases talk about at night? We did get some responses. One person said, I don't think they talk about anything at night. Okay. Another answer is, they talk about how many yachts a billionaire can buy with the money saved by cutting school lunches. All right.
I think that's probably right.
In this one, well, they don't, because the Thomases sleep in separate bedrooms. And then I don't know why they wrote snoring. Maybe it's snoring. Do you have a comment about that, or do you, Mark, even?
I mean, I think they probably talk a lot about, I think they concoct a lot of schemes about their next cool new plan to, I don't know, reinstall Trump to the presidency or something. New and fun ways to attack our democracy, and what they think the best Walmart parking lot is in the country.
Well, it would be one that has a landing strip for a private jet. Well, okay, nothing else to say. That'll conclude our Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you so much, Meagan, for being with us today, and we appreciate you giving of your time. How can people contact you or your group, or what do you want to plug? What is your website?
Well, if you want to follow me, I am still on Twitter for some reason, but my handle is @ImportantMeagan, so you can find me there. But if you want to know more about Indivisible, you can go to indivisible.org and learn more. You can join a group or start your own group and get some more resources there. But if you're really curious about court expansion and you don't believe me and you think that reform is wild and it will never happen, you can go to formore.us, and that website will convince you that court expansion is possible and necessary for a functional democracy. So that's formore.us.
The FOUR, the number 4, FOURMORE.us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, Meagan. And this week on our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, our guest is Robert Jones, founder and CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. Here's a preview.
The American religious landscape has really changed a lot. And so, for example, I think there's been a lot of claims today about, this being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, like those kinds of claims in the public square. And I think one of the reasons why we're hearing them be kind of louder and more visceral is because, in fact, it is less and less true demographically speaking today. So just over the last couple of decades, we go back to the early 2000s, the country was nearly 6 in 10 white and Christian. So if you took all white Christians together, Catholic, Protestant, non-denominational, et cetera, it was nearly 6 in 10. And that number today is 42%.
And you can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and also on FFRF's Facebook and YouTube channels.
And we also have a radio show. Don't miss Free Thought Radio this week. Annie, Laurie, and I will be looking back at Christopher Hitchens' address at FFRF's convention in 2007, where he received our Emperor Has No Clothes Award. You can find out more about Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio.
And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. See you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.